Hello and welcome my game dev friends to another tutorial. So my last tutorial was released in July of 2019. Man, it's really been a minute. By my calculations, roughly 825,120 of them to be exact. Time really does have a way of getting away from you. So this time around, we are going to be learning how to do a fairly simple effect, and that is triggering an explosion chain. So an explosion chain is pretty simple. It's just when a blocker object explodes and causes the blocker object next to it to also explode after a delay. So this is a nice way to, just juice up your project a little, so it just looks nicer than having everything blow up instantly. But it can also be used to make some interesting time delay platforming puzzles, where the player needs to blow up walls and then get some pixel perfect platforming done lickety split before the blocks disappear. Programming wise, there isn't all that much involved. We will be creating a block object that, when it explodes, simply triggers block objects next to it. It's going to do this by checking the positions, the 4 positions next to it, and then flipping a switch in that block if it's there. In this tutorial, we will also be exploring the basics of creating simple functions in GMS2, as well as using arrays and for loops. If you are new to these concepts, this will be a good primer on a use case for both. Okay, that being said, on to the tutorial. So, here we are in GameMaker Studio 2. Over here on the right-hand side of the screen is the asset browser. This is where all of the assets are held. In this folder here, intro stuff, is where I have all the stuff from that introduction. I had to program that. I actually made that through GMS2, but we're not going to mess with that. We are going to grab some assets from that and reuse them, but for the most part, we're starting fresh. So we have a room called Bomb Room, and all this is a room just to kind of make it a little easier to see the assets we're going to be exploding today. This is just a tile set. It's on a tile layer over here on the left, and it just has a handful of tiles over here. So that is all that is. The first thing we're going to do is right click and add a group or create a group. So groups used to have to be a single asset type, but now a group can be anything. And so I like to make groups based around a prefab essentially. So we're going to call this group block. We're going to put everything in this folder or this group associated with the block. It's going to be the object, the sprite, and any sound effects as well we can put in there. So the first thing we're going to do is right click, select create, and create an object. This object is called obj block. And now we're going to give it a sprite. So as I said, I don't really want to recreate that sprite, so I'm going to go over here. So we're going to go to the block folder, grab the sprite block and sprite explosion. I don't feel like redrawing those. I'm just going to drag and drop them into the block folder. And then we're going to ignore intro stuff. We don't need that anymore. So here we are with the block object. We're going to click on the sprite button where it says no sprite, going to the block folder and adding the block sprite as our sprite for it. Going to add an event and select create. This is the create event. The create event happens once whenever the object is created into the room or the scene. And this is a nice place to essentially set up all of your variables. So we're going to need a few variables for this. You can also set up your functions here as well because you don't want to continuously define functions. You just want them defined once. So we're going to define those functions in the create event. So the very first thing we're going to do is create a function. And you do that by writing function followed by the name of the function. In this case, we're going to call it clicked. Then you do some parentheses, which will allow you to pass in parameters, which are variables that go into the function that you can do things to and then return some data. In this case, we're gonna pass in a parameter called ID. Now you get to name these parameters anything you want, and they will become whatever gets passed in when you run the function. So in this case, let's say ID was 12. If I passed in 12 and I ran it, then ID would be 12. But we are going to use ID to, we're going to pass in the actual ID of an instance. Instances have IDs. These are unique identifiers to define that exact instance so you can point to it and do stuff with it. And we're using this function to find out if the mouse is both over an instance and if the left mouse button has been clicked. If that is the case, we will return true, otherwise we'll return false. We're just finding out if something got clicked on. And the reason we're doing this is because we're going to use that to trigger our explosions, because that's faster than like drawing a bomb or something. I just want to test it by clicking on it. So the next thing we're going to do is an if statement. So we're going to find out if instance position, and that is a built-in function, and it has 3 parameters, x, y, and object. What instance position does is it checks to see a exact position, an x, y coordinate, for an instance. If it finds that instance, it returns true. So for x, we're going to pass in mouse x. That is the default variable holding the x position of the mouse. We're going to pass in mouse y, same thing, but the y position. And then we're going to, for the object, we're going to pass in ID. That is going to be the ID of the instance object we want to check the position of. So if this is true, our mouse is over our ID that we passed in. So it's over our instance. We also want to find out, though, if we clicked on it. So we're going to use an AND. And we're going to use mouse check button pressed. So mouse check button pressed checks to see if a mouse button was clicked once. It only returns true once, and then it stops returning true even if you hold the button down. And we're going to pass in MB left, which is GameMaker Studio's shorthand for the left mouse button. So if all this is true, then we are over an object and we clicked on it. So then we will return true. Otherwise, we're going to return false. Very simple. All it's doing is checking if something got clicked on. Now, since we've defined our function, let's test it. We're going to test that in the step event. The step event runs once per game cycle, so however many frames per second, it's running once per frame. We're going to say if clicked, and we're passing in ID. So if this is true, we will do whatever's in these brackets, and that is instance destroy. Instance destroy is a built-in function that destroys the instance that called it, or you can pass in a number and it'll destroy the ID. So like, let's say I had an instance that was 55526 and that was its ID, I could destroy that. Otherwise, it just destroys the instance that called it, which in this case is going to be a block. So in the bomb room, we have already set up some blocks. I did that by going to instances, assets, click the block, and I just painted some in by holding the Alt key and dragging. So if we did this right, when we click on these, they will be destroyed. Let's test. Okay, it works. So the next thing we need to do is whenever we click on one of these, before it gets destroyed, we need to check the positions for the adjacent blocks, those 4 blocks there. And if there are blocks in that position, we need to essentially flip a switch on. When that switch is on, we will destroy that block. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is create another function. We're going to call this function trigger neighbor. And essentially what this function is going to do is it's going to check up, down, left, and right for another block. If it finds one, it's going to take the ID of that block, and then it is going to use that ID to turn a flag on. If that flag is on, we know that that object needs to be destroyed. So we actually need to set that flag up now. So we'll say flag on equals false. So this is a Boolean. A Boolean is either true or false. And in the case of GameMaker Studio 2, true is 1, false is 0. So you can use it mathematically as well. Now we're going to use an array to do this. So we're going to call it position to check equals boom. Now this is an array. So for example, this array could be 1, 2, 3, and 4. Okay, this would be a length 4 array. Now indexes in arrays they start at 0. So 1 here would be the 0 index, 2 would be the first, 3 the second, and so on. Now you can also nest arrays, which is what we're going to do. You can put arrays in arrays, and we're going to do this here to store the positions we want to check, because we want to check x plus 1, x minus 1, y plus 1, and y minus 1. That would be up, down, left, and right for a collision with a block. So we're going to store in the 0 index, we're going to store where we want to check on x, and 1 index is going to be y. So we're going to check x plus 1, and then we don't want to change the y on that, so that'll be 0. We want to check x minus 1, which is to the left, 1 pixel to the left of our object. Y will stay consistent. We want to check with x consistent and y plus 1. with x consistent and y minus 1. That is going to be our 4 directions. So we're storing that into array. Now we're going to use a for loop to iterate over this array, and a for loop is written this way. We're going to say I equals 0. That is setting up the initial value of I, and I could be anything. It's just a variable that we're going to use to iterate. And we're going to do the next part of this is going to be the while portion. It runs while this is true, and that's while I is lower than array length. And we want to check the position to check array, and then I++. And then this has some brackets because it's doing this here, do this. So what this means is this. We've initialized I as 0. This for loop will run while this is true. So array length returns the length of position to check. So while I is smaller than the length of this array, we are going to do whatever is in here. Whenever it gets to the bottom here and finishes whatever is inside of these brackets, it is going to do what's here, which in this case is I++, which means I plus itself, essentially I plus 1. So we're going to add 1 to I. We're going to iterate. And we're using that to iterate over this array. So we're going to use something called a local variable. You do that by writing var. So if I wrote var x, this is a local variable. So var x equals 10, for example. A local variable is local to how it was instantiated. I couldn't, since I put it in the create event here, I couldn't use it in the step event. It will be forgotten it'll be forgotten right away. So if it was declared in a step event, it can only be used within the scope that it was instantiated. We're doing that because we don't really need this thing to stick around. So var, and we're going to call the var ID equals instance place. Now, what instance place is, it's a function that checks a position for a collision with another instance of an object, and it returns, here's the important part, it returns the ID. So it's pretty much the same as place meeting, but it gives us a ID, and we're using it to get the ID of these values of these objects up, down, left, or right within this array. So we're going to use the array to check the positions, and then if there's a collision, we're going to grab that ID. And so now first we want to check the x position, so that's going to be x plus position to check index, and then remember x is on the first index, so in this case that's 0. Y plus position to check. Again, we're checking I. So the first time it runs, we're checking this array. The second time it'll check this one, third and fourth. And again, we'll be looking here for x and here for y. Here for x, here for y. So position to check I, and then 1, because remember, this is index 1, and that's where we're holding the y positions. And we are looking for the block. So essentially, we are looking for an object there. If we find one, we're going to get its ID. If there's nothing there, this ID value will be something called no one, such as this. That's how it's spelled. That means nothing. It's null. So it's either going to give us an ID or null. So we're going to then ask if ID does not equal no one. So we found something, in which case we are going to turn it on. So ID flag on equals true. So we are using the ID of that value of that object, and then we're going to, this is the flag on variable. We are turning that on. And there we go. That's all we need to do. So we've triggered the neighbor. So using this function, we are checking all 4 directions for an instance. If we find one, we are turning the flag on to true. Now, we need to change some stuff here. So now we're going to modify clicked. We don't want to destroy the object anymore. We want it to set flag on to true. And then we want to add an if event. If flag on which means if flag on is true. Then we want to trigger neighbor. So if a block gets turned on, we want to check all the adjacent blocks, and then if there's any adjacent blocks, also turn those on. And then we're going to destroy ourselves. So if this worked, when we click on a block, they should all pretty much blow up instantly or very, very quickly. Let's find out. There we go. It worked. Okay, so now we just need to modify this a little bit to make it look nice and play that animation. Alright, so we're going to need a few more variables. We need time to destroy, and we'll set that for the time being to something like 10. We also need a value called time, and we're going to set that to 0. So we're going to modify all this a bit. So if we click on something on one of these blocks, it turns it on. If it is on, you're going to add to time. So time plus plus. What that does is every time this cycles, while this flag is on, it's going to add the time. If time equals time to destroy, so that means if we've reached the limit that we set here, in this case 10, then 10 frames have gone by, and we're going to then, after that delay, destroy the object and then trigger its neighbors, and also we're going to play a little animation. So we're going to do it this way. We're going to say trigger neighbor, instance destroy. We also need to create an explosion object, and we also need to play a sound. So that's some stand-in stuff right there. So we're going to trigger our neighbors, create an explosion object, and then play a sound effect. Let's go ahead and test it and see if we have a delay now on destruction. We do. So it works. Now it is kind of consistent, right? So one thing that makes games a little juicier is just a bit of randomization. So let's change time to destroy to iRandom range. iRandom range returns an integer between two values. The reason we want it to be an integer is because we're iterating time by 1. If we were to have something smaller than 1, then we could easily skip past time to destroy. We want to make sure it is an integer. And we'll say between, I don't know, 4 and 8. Those are our values. So now the time to destroy for each and every block is a little different. It's between 4 and 8. Yeah, see, it kind of adds a little bit of just a little bit of difference to each one. We're going to need another object. So let's create a group. We're going to call this explosion. Now, I already have the explosion animation. I just need to have an explosion object. So create object. We're going to call this obj boom. We're going to give it a sprite called SPR explosion. And this is going to be really simple. We're going to have a create event. We're going to give it a random angle on create. So each one that gets created will be a random angle. So image angle equals random 360. That just gives it a random value between 0 and 360. So it's going to have a random angle. We could even kind of modify the size a bit. I don't think that's necessary though. All we need to do now is clean it up. So under add event, go to other. We're looking for animation end. This gets triggered whenever any animation on this object is over. So here you could do things like if sprite index equals, SPR explosion, then you could do one thing. Now we only have one animation possible, so we don't actually need to check that. So whenever the animation is over, we're going to destroy the object, just because we don't want them hanging around wasting memory. Very simple. That's all we need to do there. Now back to the step event on the block. We need to create the explosion effect, and we're going to do that with instance create depth. This creates an instance at a depth. It takes x, y, depth, and object. We're going to create it at the x position of the block, the y position of the block, the depth -1 of the block. Now -1 is closer to the player, the screen. So it's going to be in front of the block because I don't want the explosion to be behind it. I want it to look like it's in front of it and taking up the space of the block. And then we're going to make the block disappear looking like it exploded. And we're creating it. The object is going to be OBJ boom is what we're creating. And that's that. Now if we play it, they're going to have a little explosion effect. Uh-oh, what'd I do? Object block OBJ boom not set before reading it. Always remember case sensitive. I'm actually being inconsistent here, so let's change this back to lowercase obj, and let's just rename this. It thought it was a variable because it couldn't find that object because I wasn't using the right case. Okay, let's test it and see what happens. So it works, but it didn't look quite right to me. I think that the explosion effect is a little too big, so let's do something else. We're going to do something called with. When you do with, so with instance create. With will essentially, anything you put inside the parentheses, it runs that code as if it was being run from that object. So we are now creating this boom object, and everything in here is being done to that boom object. So we're going to say image x scale equals 0.5, image y scale equals 0.5. As a matter of fact, this is one way to do it. We could also just do it within the create event as well for the explosion, which I think would be better. And I misspelled y scale, so it's not going to know what I'm doing. It's going to throw an error. Here, forget this. Undo that. We're going back to the boom object under the create event, and that's where we're going to change the size of it. Image x scale equals random range. So we're going to give a little bit of random sizing to this. We're going to say 0.4 to 0.6. As a matter of fact, we're going to do this. Var scalar equals, and the reason I'm doing that is because I want the x scale and y scale to be the same. So I don't want to have a random x scale and a random y scale. So I'm going to set scalar to this random value, and then I'm going to set x and y scale to that. So image x scale equals scalar, image y scale equals scalar. There, much better. And lastly, let's play a sound. So I wrote a script called play sound. I like it better than the default audio playing script, and I'm going to use that. It's already been imported. That's an intro stuff. You don't need to worry about that. But if you wanted to play something, a sound effect, the default way, it's audio play sound. But I wrote a play sound script, so I'm going to use it, play sound, and I'm playing the sound I already imported called sound explode 2, and then I'm going to fill it out. So false for the looping, minimum frequency 0.5 to 1, gain is 1, priority is 1. So what my script does is essentially you can play a sound, you can loop that sound, and you can set a random frequency on it, as well as the gain and the priority. And that's that. We have exploding blocks. So that's pretty much it, guys. We did it. We have blocks that explode in a chain reaction now. All right, well, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you found it interesting and educational. There may be more videos on the way. Then again, there may not. Who knows? It's a mystery. All right, guys, as always, I appreciate it, and I hope you guys have a fantastic insert whatever here. Day, week, month, year, life, eternity. I don't know. Anyway, see you on the flip side. Peace out.